All right, wake up. Sorry, that was how I got to. Unfortunately, I think all of our children were out late last night partying and celebrating JMU's big football win yesterday because weren't here for a children's sermon, but that was part of what we got at 8:30. It was an opportunity to wake up because I was never good at being woken up in the morning, still not. But I think our reading today is one that encourages us to wake up, that encourages a waking up at the end of a string of great dreams. Because 2 weeks ago, Pastor Lauren invited us into what many like to call the Joseph novella, essentially the large narrative section of Genesis that is devoted to telling the story of this son of Jacob and his conflict with his brothers. She invited us to consider this dreamer and the dreams he dreamed. She invited us to rest in this community with one another and dream God's dream for Muhlenberg and the world around us. And then last week, reflecting on how Joseph's dreams got him into trouble, thrown in a pit, sold into slavery, arrested in Egypt, and drawn before Pharaoh himself. I shared that Joseph, interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh that quickly became a nightmare scenario for Egypt, he invites us to consider the ways that the dreams too often become a nightmare for our neighbors and ourselves. Once again, calling us back to God's dream for creation, I hoped that we'd find a place to rest together in this hope and rise in peace. So in the midst of all these dreams, it's time to wake up with Joseph in today's story. We've got a little bit of action that follows after the chapters from last week, between last week's dream interpretation and where we pick up this Sunday. What we see is that during the severe famine which Joseph foretold, back in Canaan, Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy grain. They didn't recognize that the powerful governor they met was their brother Joseph, sold into slavery years before. Joseph recognized them immediately, his own nightmare standing before him. He accused them of being spies and imprisoned Simeon, demanding they return with their youngest brother, Benjamin. Reluctantly, the brothers returned home and brought Benjamin back to Egypt. Joseph was overwhelmed with emotion, but continued to test them by secretly returning their money that they paid for food to see how they would react. But then the following day, Joseph put his bigger plan into action. Joseph had his own silver cup hidden in Benjamin's sack and sent his steward to catch them on the road and accuse them of theft. When the brothers were confronted, they were horrified and returned to Joseph's palace, pleading for Benjamin's freedom. In the midst of this, Judah actually stepped forward, offering himself as a substitute, demonstrating how much he and his brothers had changed since their earlier betrayal of Joseph. But at that moment, Joseph could no longer contain his feelings. Now, if you step back and hear all of that, and consider all that had happened to Joseph, you might think that perfectly reasonable that he would snap here and no longer be able to contain his emotions in the face of those who tormented him and hated him so much those years ago. Joseph had been living the dream in Egypt now after some rough years, but now he's living the dream, but his own nightmare has come there to beg mercy of him. I'll admit Pastor Lauren's sermon 2 weeks ago didn't land as effectively for me as I'm sure she would have hoped it would, because I was in the middle of a stretch of nightmares. I was not sleeping well. I was having terrible dreams. So when I came to worship, the last thing that I wanted to do was hear about some dreamer with joyful dreams. But I am glad that I heard the sermon twice that Sunday, because I was able to step back a little further and a little more awake with a little more coffee. I realized I have been living the dream lately. I started taking a class recently where the instructor has us start each week with our highs and lows and hopes, or rosebud thorns. And I was having to get really creative to think of an answer for my rose and my high that was anything other than, take a look at this picture of my daughter smiling. Can you name me a prettier rose or a higher high than this? Because I can't find one. Like, this is it. This is the high. This is the dream. Being her dad has been a dream, and I'm just loving it. So I was thinking those kinds of happy thoughts the other day as I was getting her ready in the morning, and got her a new diaper and got her dressed and ready for the day. She laid down on the bed, and I could tell that she wanted to play. She just wanted to look all around and explore, and she kept reaching up for my face. So I leaned in, and very gently she felt my nose and starts to feel my cheeks, and she ran her hands over my ears, just learning all these different changes on my face. And very gently she started to reach up and feel my hair. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. This is the dream. This is pure magic. This is just watching my baby learn and grow and experience the world in new ways, and all of a sudden, faster than I could have ever imagined a 6-month-old moving, she grabs 2 big handfuls of hair and goes, yoink! I jumped back, and she sat there grinning, with 2 very full fists of my long blonde hair in her grubby little hands. And just like Joseph, tears were streaming from my eyes, too. And forget coffee, nothing wakes you up quite like an infant ripping whole bunches of hair out of your head. Genesis says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, and I am right there with you. I'm there with you, Joseph. It's time to start letting her have it. That little hair-ripping, diaper-filling, late-night crying, snot-smearing poop goblin who is completely helpless and is keeping me on my toes every second of the day. But I didn't think that. I was still living the dream, just with slightly less hair. I laughed because she learned something new about hair that day, just as she was learning all about the world around her. Hair can be pulled and daddies can yell ow and cry. Yes, she rips and diaper fills and cries and gets boogers, and she's still a joy. I could be resentful of all the ways that my life has changed since becoming a father. A little smile makes me remember all the good as well. All of that challenging stuff is true, and it's tough, but I'm living the dream, even as I'm pulling my own hair out of her little iron fists. And in a similar way, where Joseph could have exploded, sought vengeance, thrown his own brothers in a pit. Now that would be a cruel twist of irony, but pure justice. Truly have them bow down to him as he crushed them and their lineage forever for the evil that they had wrought against their own kin. He doesn't. Instead, it says, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Come closer to me. I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. It's remarkable how quiet God is throughout Joseph's story. In Genesis, we see God speaking a lot, like speaking life into being in creation, working through the flood, speaking directly to Abraham, and more. God is very active throughout this entire book, but seems suddenly so quiet during the story of Joseph. God is quiet right here until the end, where Joseph rises to say, it's been God all along. God sent him. God protected him. God has delivered the people of Egypt and those in this whole region from terrible famine through the gifts that were given to Joseph. God is glorified, and Joseph is restored to his family. God doesn't have to speak through big, grand theophanies in order to be seen and known. God was speaking a quiet, persistent, shall we say, dreamlike voice through the whole story of Joseph. God has a dream for this world and for all people. God's dream is life and hope, sufficiency for all, peace and mercy. God dreamed that dream through Joseph, and because Joseph rested in the presence of God and renewed himself in hope, when the great moment of confrontation came with his brothers, he woke up still dreaming. Like grand confrontations with our former enemies, there's something as simple and effective as an infant ripping hair out of your head. There are plenty of ways to be suddenly woken up. The key is whether or not we wake up dreaming. Are we waking up to the needs of our world around us in a way that keeps dreaming God's dream in this place? Are we resting together and allowing ourselves to dream God's dream? Or are we stewing in bitterness and resentment that we wake up living a nightmare of vengeance and division? Joseph had every right to seek a vengeance and be angry with his brothers. It would have been very understandable if he woke up and pursued that course. But he didn't do that. He woke up and gave them Goshen, the best lands where their people could grow and thrive, building on the dream that God had dreamed within him that Abraham's descendants would outnumber the stars. When we rest in God's dream, where we take a breath of God's hope and we wake up dreaming. We wake up with love and grace. We wake up with mercy and restoration. We wake up to abundance and share the bounty of God to a world around us in need. We don't hold grudges and crush those with whom we disagree. We give them Goshen, the best lands, room for them and their children and their children's children. We wake up dreaming and invite others to rest and dream and wake up in God's dream too. Throughout this fall, our community has encouraged one another that in all we do as a community in worship and in learning and in service, everything that makes Muhlenberg, we say, take a breath. This isn't here to stress you. This isn't here to make you more busy. It's here to give you a space where you can breathe. Take a breath. Take a snore. Take a snooze. You ever heard a pastor tell you can sleep through a sermon? Probably won't happen again. Rest in this place and rise to resurrection life. Rise to the dream being at hand. The dreamer shows us that God shows up in the least expected places, in a pit, in a prison, in a foreign land, in service, in an undeserved restoration. The dreamer shows us that God shows up again in the most unexpected places, in a manger, among sinners, on a cross, among us again, scarred but very much alive, in an undeserved restoration, but one that is freely and joyfully given, a measure overflowing with mercy. So dream with me, dear ones. Rest in God's good news and let us rise together to see what God's dream for this place will be. Let us rest in God's promises and be reminded of the one who loves us to life, that we may each day wake up dreaming. Amen.